Good afternoon and welcome to the City of Casey Council meeting on the 19th of September. My name is Nolene Duff and I'm the Chair Administrator here at the City of Casey. And I'll start with introductions. My colleague Administrator, Mr Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, Chair.
Our Chief Executive Officer, Mr Glenn Patterson. Marty Cuthbert, who's the Acting Director, City Planning and Infrastructure. Jen Bednar, Director Customer and Corporate Services. Steve Coldham, Director Community Life. Matthew, AV Technician, and Nicole Rode and Michelle Tipton are supporting us in the governance area this afternoon. I welcome other staff that are here present and thank you to those of you who have joined us both in the gallery and online. I will start with an apology on behalf of our colleague Mr Miguel Belmar, who is away at the moment. So would you like to move that apology?
Yeah, I'll move the apology be accepted.
Thank you, and I second that. All in favour, carried. I now move to the statement of acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. Item 1.2 is the diversity statement. The City of Casey is home to remarkable diversity with many cultures, languages, faiths and communities of worship, ages, LGBTQI+ identities and landscapes, together forming our rich and dynamic community story. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. Move to item 2, which is the confirmation of minutes, and there's one previous set of meeting minutes to be confirmed for the council meeting on the 15th of August 2023. Do I have a mover?
I'll move those minutes, Chair.
Seconded, and all in favour, carried. Item 3, declaration of interests. I've considered my obligations under section 130 of the Local Government Act 2020 and do not have a conflict of interest relevant to the agenda papers. Do any council officers or administrators have conflicts to declare?
I've got nothing to declare, Chair.
Thank you. Public question time. There are 18 public questions submitted through Council's website this afternoon for today's meeting, and I'll work through each of those questions. The first is from Sandra Karatsivas, and the subject matter is stakeholders. Can you explain exactly what a stakeholder is? Does any member, extended family member of the Casey Council have any stakeholders in our council boundaries? Where do we find all the stakeholders listed? In response, the Communications Manager has provided the following. Stakeholders are defined within the City of Casey's Community Engagement Policy available on the City of Casey website. The definition outlines stakeholders as individuals, groups of individuals, organisations or political entities who are interested in or impacted by a council outcome or decision. Stakeholder mapping is regularly undertaken across the organisation to ensure that we are identifying the appropriate stakeholders to actively engage with and to identify those stakeholders that need to be kept informed. The second question is from Dave Perry, and the topic is the Casey Urban Forest Strategy. The majority of land in Casey is private land. Tree canopy cover is declining fast, and research shows that no amount of planting on public land can make up for the loss of mature trees on private land. Given this, and given that Casey aims to significantly grow its canopy cover, why didn't the recently publicly exhibited draft Casey Urban Forest Strategy not contain a tree protection local law such as recently introduced in neighbouring Greater Dandenong? In response, the Acting Manager of City Presentation has made the following response. Council officers are reviewing all feedback obtained during the most recent consultation phase for the draft Urban Forest Strategy Greening Casey. As part of the revised document, Council may include an objective to conduct a feasibility study on a tree protection local law or similar and examine the mechanisms of other councils, the results and the effectiveness of such a change. Question 3 is from Kerry Brown regarding council finances. Is the Casey City Council currently in debt? And the question is, Casey currently holds secured borrowings to the value of $30.55 million as at 30th of June 2023. These borrowings are scheduled to be repaid in full within the next 5 years. Borrowings have been used to fund a major capital asset and an extraordinary operating expense. Question 4, council elections, also from Kerry Brown. What is the process of becoming a councillor in the 2024 council elections? In response, prospective candidates should read Section 34 of the Local Government Act 2020 to ensure that they are eligible to stand for council. Prior to nominating, candidates will be required to complete the mandatory local government training through Local Government Victoria. Nominations open around mid-September and candidates will be required to submit their statements, photographs and questionnaires. The election is conducted by the Victorian Electoral Commission. City of Casey will be holding information sessions for anyone who may be interested in becoming a candidate, which will cover these processes and requirements. Details will be made available on Council's website soon. Question 5 is from Stephen Matalek regarding car parks and revenue raising. And the question is, Marinda Park Station car park has been full lately. Some cars have parked on the grass. There is no sign saying cars cannot park on the grass, and cars being there is not affecting anyone as it's in the middle of nowhere. Multiple people have received fines for this, and it seems the council want to target the area to raise revenue. How often does the council check the car park to issue fines, and how many fines has council issued? In response, the Marinda Park train station is owned by the state government. As such, the station and car park are not subject to council parking patrols. Parking on the nature strip is prohibited under Victorian road safety road rules. This area is not subject to regular patrols. The area in the vicinity of the Marinda Park has a complex ownership structure shared between state government, private enterprise and council. Council's role is to educate and ensure drivers understand the rules and their responsibilities when driving and parking their vehicles. As such, officers may, when identified, issue infringement notices for non-compliance with legislation. 88 fines have been issued for parking on nature strips during 2023. Question 6 is from Paul Greenman, and the subject is Constitution. Is our Constitution, Commonwealth of Australia 1900 UK Act still valid, and does the Casey Council follow it? Yes or no answers, please. The Local Government Act 2020 gives effect to Section 74A1 of the Constitution Act 1975, which provides that local government is a distinct and essential tier of government consisting of democratically elected councils. The City of Casey is legislated to comply with the Local Government Act 2020 and as such the Constitution Act 1975. Question 7 is also from Paul Greenman, and the subject is oaths sworn. Where do we find the signed copies certified of the sworn oaths of the CEO and councillors that would be required by all government positions? In response, in accordance with the Local Government Act, a councillor must take the oath or affirmation before the Chief Executive Officer. The signed oath or affirmation by councillors for the 2016 term can be found in the minutes of the special meeting held on the 10th of November 2016. Question 8 is from Raymond Darley regarding Hampton Park Hill Development Plan. When is Council expecting the Minister of Planning to present the proposed amendment to the DPO that was endorsed by Council, yet against the residents' best interests and objections, to be submitted for further public consultation? In response, Council resolved to request the Minister for Planning, the Department of Transport and Planning, in July 2023 to prepare a draft planning scheme amendment to the Casey Planning Scheme and place the amendment on exhibition for public comment. Since that time, Council officers have been working with DTP and the EPA to assist the preparation of the draft technical planning scheme amendment documentation. That documentation is expected to be lodged with the Department of Transport and Planning in December of this year, who will then consider the request for authorisation before Council is able to place the amendment on exhibition for further public comment in accordance with the Act. The next question is also from Raymond Darley, question 9, on the same topic of the Hampton Park Hill Development Plan. Will Council ensure that any application for a permit to build a commercial waste transfer station lodged by Veolia will not be granted before due and respectful consideration is given to the EPA's new proposed buffer zones due this year that are designed to protect residents and their families being subject to any further adverse and harmful environmental impact on their homes? In response, if an application is lodged by Veolia, Council has a responsibility to assess the application based on the controls within the scheme that apply at that time. An application must also be assessed within the statutory time period as set out in the Planning and Environment Act. The EPA's proposed new buffer zones are currently in draft format only. There's no indication as to when and in what form these will be translated into the planning scheme. Any application lodged will be assessed against Clause 53.10 and referred to the Environment Protection Authority as required within this clause. Question 10 is from Troy Van Gorp. And the subject is forbidden from complaining. I want to know what Council's position is in relation to a restriction placed on all subdivided properties in 2002, which forbids complaints regarding operations of the concrete batching plant. I also highlight that new Australians are frightened to complain about the tip and transfer station as they struggle to differentiate between the tip and the batching plant. I want to know what Council will do to rectify this restriction and communicate to impacted landowners. In response, in December 2001, a planning permit was issued, number 00861-01, to erect and use a silo associated with concrete batching. The limitation on complaints regarding the operations of the concrete batching plant relates to its approval and establishment prior to the subdivision. The concrete batching plant was lawfully operating and established under that planning permit prior to the subdivision approval, and therefore complaints about its existence would not be considered by Council. However, any concerns regarding operational matters that are not in accordance with the planning permit conditions and/or any Environment Protection Authority permits can be considered with appropriate evidence. Question 11 is from Pete Wilson. Subject is costs. I'd like to know the salaries of the 3 administrators, and does that salary come out of ratepayers' pockets? In response, the Manager Communications and Corporate Governance has provided the following response. The allowances payable to administrators are determined by the Minister for Local Government in accordance with the Victorian Government's appointment and remuneration guidelines. The City of Casey does not determine the level of the allowance, but is required to make these payments as directed. The remuneration details are listed each year in the annual report and available on the City of Casey website. The allowances for 21-22 are listed on page 105 and are as follows. With respect to Mr Boardman and Mr Belmar, the remuneration is $149,560. and with regard to myself, $285,520, and those figures are plus superannuation. Question 12 is also from Pete Wilson, works done. What am I getting for the money I pay, as the roads in Casey and footpaths locally are in terrible condition? So in the time we've lived in Cranny, nothing has been done. In response, Casey's Road Management Plan 2021 documents the standards, policies and management systems used by the City of Casey to manage, inspect, repair and maintain roads for which it is responsible. The City of Casey is only responsible for local roads, not all roads in the city. Many main roads and highways in general terms are the responsibility of the state government. A significant proportion of Council's maintenance budget is allocated towards maintaining the local road network to the standards outlined in this document. In addition, Council delivers capital improvements to the road network annually. In 23-24, $20.56 million has been allocated to renewal and upgrades to the Casey local road network. Some of the projects listed for delivery in 2023-24 in the suburbs of Cranbourne are road construction of Volk Road, Chevron Avenue, Bellato Road into the Cranbourne Gardens and a southern entrance to Casey Fields. Installing a pedestrian crossing at Stawell Street, streetscape renewal at Hotham Street, major upgrade of the Bellato Road and South Gippsland Highway intersection, road rehabilitation or reseals. If there's an issue with a road or footpath, the community can report to Council using the Snap Send Solves app. Council will inspect and make safe dangerous roads and footpaths within 30 working days of a report being received. Question 13 and question 14 are from Brian Oates and both relate to Casey aged community and aged care and disability service changes. The first question is a question I submitted to Council in July regarding benefits for the Casey aged community was responded to. However, I was not able to identify any benefits in the response. As the Council still needs to raise rates by the maximum possible amount since the 8 million redundancies, it appears there were no economic benefits for the community arising from this action. Is that correct, or are there any tangible benefits that were omitted in the response? In response, our Manager Connected Communities has provided the following. The City of Casey is committed to creating an age-friendly community where people of all ages and abilities are supported to access the infrastructure and services needed to live and age well. Further to the response provided at the July meeting, highlighting Council's financial commitment to delivering on the Living and Ageing Well Action Plan, the transition out of traditional aged services is also supporting Council's future financial sustainability. When Council was delivering its full suite of aged and disability services, data highlighted 8% of the older population and 4% of the disability population were being supported through Council services. By adopting the Living and Ageing Well Action Plan 23-25 in March this year, Council's focus will be broader than direct service delivery, as Council's demographic modelling indicates our older population will increase by 60% or 122,000 people by 2041, accounting for 22% of Casey's total population. The Living and Ageing Well Action Plan focuses on creating a community where people of all ages, especially older people and people with a disability, have greater access to their community services and supports. This includes improving the infrastructure such as transport, housing and availability of access to health and social services and activities. The further question from Mr. Oates is the following. I also asked about communications regarding the aged care and disability service changes. There was no response from Council on that. I recently received from the Casey Council information on the ceasing of an allied health pilot program. I had never heard of it before and cannot find anyone else who did. I require more detailed response on the question of communications of existing and recently joining aged and disabled of Casey. The Allied Health Pilot Program was an interim pilot to assist people who were needing to access allied health services through the aged care system. This pilot was widely promoted to seniors and community groups and by the Regional Assessment Service, who are the responsible body for assessing Casey residents for aged care services. The pilot is currently being reviewed. Communication about its future will be shared with the community by the end of this year. Question 15 is from Sandy Plapp regarding the referendum yes vote. It has been reported in the media that some councils have donated up to $40,000 to the Yes campaign. Has Casey Council donated, and if so, how much and why? The main role of a council is local roads, parks, libraries, waste disposal and many community services. The City of Casey remains neutral on the Voice to Parliament. We are committed to ensuring our residents have access to accurate information leading up to the national referendum in order to make an informed decision. Council has not provided funding towards the Yes or to the No campaigns. Question 16 is from Annette Newey regarding plastics. With the government introducing tougher penalties for plastic usage, will the admin of Casey charge residents extra for the amount of plastic that is collected in their rubbish? Yes or no? In response, the intended federal government changes to a mandatory packaging system would put greater responsibility on the packaging industry for the products they sell. Companies will need to design and manufacture packaging so that it reduces waste and increases the ability to recover and recycle. The proposed changes should reduce the amount of non-recyclable plastic that needs to be sent to landfill and make it easier for residents to sort materials for recycling. However, it is not yet clear what impact these changes will have on local government waste service costs. Any cost or saving would be factored into the calculation of the waste services charge each year. With or without the federal government changes, it is likely that the cost of waste management and recycling in Victoria will continue to increase due to increases in the state-imposed landfill levy, compliance with state government curbside reforms, and increasing fuel and other labour costs. Question 17 is also from Annette Newey, the subject being companies and plastics. With consumers having very little impact on how their items are packaged and knowing full well that once these changes to plastics are implemented, the consumer will pay for the cost of any changes made, will the admin of Casey Council defend consumers from this obvious extortion or seize this as an opportunity to impose further penalties and collect revenue? In response, the current voluntary packaging system has failed to meet recycling targets. Many products are difficult to recycle because there are no end markets or they are made of layers of different material that can't be viably separated in current systems. The proposed changes should reduce the amount of non-recyclable plastic that needs to be sent to landfill and make it easier for residents to sort materials for recycling. Whilst it is sometimes difficult to make sustainable choices, consumers do have a role to play in minimising waste through their purchasing. Many Casey residents have reduced their waste significantly. Also, the implementation of the Container Deposit Scheme in Victoria in November this year will allow residents to return many packaging items, including drink bottles, and receive a 10-cent rebate. We encourage you to visit the Green Living in Casey Facebook page for great conversations and waste reduction tips. The final question this afternoon is from Diane Harris. Question 18 regarding the Bayview Park steps. We received a posted plan of the steps from Council. It referred to the overview of the plans for the proposed works. Access into the car park will be limited to daytime hours and controlled by the lockable gates, which will remain at the entrance to the park. To date, there are no lockable gates. We're getting cars going up and down to the park anywhere between 9:30 p.m. and 3:30 a.m. When will the gates be installed? In response, our community safety team have just completed a report into issues relating to the car park at 1001 Steps and are currently looking into options to secure access to the car park after hours. We're looking at a couple of options to gate the car park and expect to have a solution to present to the Capital Works project team within the next 4 to 8 weeks. Once the recommended option is determined, we'll seek funding through our Capital Works budget to implement this financial year. So that concludes our questions this afternoon. I now move on to item 5, officer reports for consideration, and the first of those is item 5.1, the Audit and Risk Committee Chairperson's Report. And we are joined this afternoon by the Chairperson of our Audit and Risk Committee, Mr John Nguyen, and I will firstly seek a mover and a seconder for the report and hand over to Mr Boardman, who'll introduce Mr Nguyen.
Chair, I'll move item 5.1 and the recommendation is put.
Thank you, and I'll second that, and I'll hand over to you.
And Chair, it's my delight to introduce Mr John Nguyen, the Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. He has submitted a report which is included as attachment 5.1.1 in the council papers, and I now invite Mr Nguyen to speak to his report.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Good afternoon all. I'm pleased to present the biannual report of the Audit and Risk Committee in accordance with the Local Government Act. The report presents a summary of activities of the committee over the last 6 months. And over the last 6 months, the committee met on 3 occasions, principally to discuss and to talk about issues relating to financial reporting, risk management and other compliance-related activities. With respect to the actual activities that were discussed during the 3 meetings, I can probably categorise them into a number of categories. The first being consideration of the annual financial report, and we spoke about the annual report on 3 of the occasions. We also talked about the activities of internal audit. An internal audit during the 6 months reviewed and considered topics relating to council's compliance with its workplace and planning and development activities, review of legislative compliance, a review of the transformation activities and payroll activities. We also considered some of the good governance measure relating to the council, specifically the statutory and ethical compliance. We also considered the report by VAGO, which is the Victorian Auditor General Office. The other item that I talked about is the financial report, financial statements for the City of Casey, which will be considered at today's meeting. Finally, I want to complete my report by acknowledging the good work of council officers in supporting the committee, and also want to acknowledge my fellow committee members for their participation. I will leave it at that, Mr. Boardman, and happy to take any questions.
Chair, I don't have any questions for Mr Nguyen, apart from acknowledging his service as Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee in what has been a very comprehensive and busy schedule over the last reporting period. Mr Nguyen has alluded to the various activities that the Audit and Risk Committee has undertaken during that period, including and importantly the consideration of the shell account reports, the draft financial statements, the financial report updates and the Victorian Auditor General's Office 2023 audit strategy. We do have, as Mr Nguyen has alluded to, these matters for consideration at agenda item 5.2, and I will make some further comments then. I would like to place on the record, if I could, Chair, my sincere appreciation again to Mr Nguyen. It is a significant expectation from Mr Nguyen and the other committee members, Carol Pagnon and Ernest Stabic, to ensure that they approach their duties and their responsibilities as member of the Audit and Risk Committee vigilantly and professionally. The amount of information that is contained within the average Audit and Risk Committee's reports are significant and do require some extensive evaluation, assessment and preparation before each meeting. And as Mr Nguyen has alluded to, the support and feedback and assistance we receive from council officers is par none, and that also needs to be firmly placed on the record that the amount of further information and clarification that is sought from all council and committee members is significant, and we do appreciate the expediency and the vigilance in which those matters are attended to and reported back to us. So with those comments, and I will save further comments when we deal with the financial statements proper, I do thank John, I thank Carol, I thank Ernest, and do appreciate again his commitment to this task.
Thank you, Mr Boardman, and I note your representation on the Audit Committee on behalf of the panel of administrators. It's quite an intense program, the three meetings in the last 6 months and the extensive detail that's covered across not only financial reporting but risk management, a range of internal audit reports, a focus on good governance, and a range of other matters. So with that, I put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.2 is the 2022-23 budget outcomes, financial statements and performance statements. And I ask for a mover.
Chair, I'll move the recommendations as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll second. And would you like to speak to the motion?
Chair, in moving the recommendations, I'll begin my comments by clearly articulating that this is one of the most significant and important activities of ourselves as administrators and for the council as a whole. Of course, we are dealing with a sizable organisation here, some significant revenue, significant expenditures, a significant base of services that are provided to the community, which come at a considerable cost. And in moving these recommendations and adopting the reports, we have publicly described and articulated how we are compared against other councils on a performance basis, which I will allude to in the performance statement attachment 2, but importantly how we allocate rate revenue and other revenue from the organisation into meeting the expectations for services and other commitments on behalf of the community. There are a number of components to these reports. We are adopting the financial statements and the performance statement. We are adopting the final management letter, the closing report from the Victorian Auditor General. We're noting the budget outcome for 2020-22-23. We are approving carryover for the Capital Works program, which I'll also make some further comments to. We are approving a budget variation to the Capital Works program, which is a necessary statutory requirement, and we are endorsing the governance and management checklist. So if I could start with the overall financial result, and there are a number of factors that we do need to consider when taking into consideration that the surplus of $5 million might on the surface seem relatively impressive, but it is based on what has been an interesting first full financial year post-COVID. So it really is the first financial year period, reporting period, that we have not been subject to disruptions either in the business or other regulatory related disruptions, and we've been able to utilise that full 12-month period to assess the council's operations, our cost base, our expenditure base, our services base, and to get a clear picture of what our commitments and obligations in the future is. There are a number of employee related costs that have been reduced, primarily because we have come out of the Working for Victoria program, which did see the state government funded a significant amount of additional individuals within the organisation, up to about 180 during the COVID period as part of the recovery package. A number of those individuals have been retained by the organisation, but many more have not been retained, primarily because the length of their tenure and the funding associated with those positions did in fact cease. So that is something that we do need to take in consideration when looking at the overall employment situation. We have received additional operational grants income because we're operating in a situation where we have a significant amount of interest rate rises, which affect not just our obligations from debt and borrowings, but also has had a positive effect on our interest income. That also is contributing to the overall result. So there are a number of factors that need to be considered, and most importantly that we have made this point quite significant at past council meetings around the higher obligation on behalf of this organisation and all municipalities as it relates to waste management and general maintenance costs. This is something that is a regulatory instruction from Spring Street. It is something that all councils are faced with. These costs will need to be borne by councils. The compensation that has been offered by the state government is insufficient to meet the obligations under our new statutory obligations. So this was something that we do need to place on notice, Chair, that will be an ongoing commitment and ongoing challenge to the organisation as a whole. The Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee did note that on the 12th of September we did comprehensively evaluate these statements. We did provide feedback to the statements, and that has been addressed in the statements themselves. I just want to make some further points in relation to the balance sheet, which appears on page 23 of the council reports, and this goes to the question that I think was asked in question time regarding council, its debt position. The balance sheet is very healthy. There is assets of over $7 billion. That has increased by nearly $500 million, primarily because of the revaluation of the assets, the capital works program being on track, but obviously there has been some challenges that we've alluded to in other council meetings around the phasing of the capital works. There's an increase in non-monetary contributions, there's an increase in financial assets because of the interest income that I have alluded to, and there has also been some offsets relating to write-offs, disposals and depreciations. One point that was raised by the Auditor General, Chair, which is of note, which will be reflected in the final management letter, is a review that we have conducted in relation to asset valuation policy and also the phasing of our asset valuations to ensure that we are conducting this in a specific frequency which allows the asset to be categorised and revalued appropriate to what market conditions are, and that also that when we are dealing with aspects around current replacement costs, particularly in relation to the depreciation of the replacement costs, that those references are clarified and in some cases removed, so that we are maintaining fair valuation principles as it relates to our balance sheet position. So whilst that might sound somewhat technical, it is a very important recommendation from the Victorian Auditor General's Office, because we don't want to be in a situation of having misrepresentations on our balance sheet, which would then have other impacts on expenditure and our overall financial position. There are some other aspects that we do need to make note of when adopting these reports. One is the exit, which again we have made reference to previously, from the Municipal Association Victoria self-insurer, the Work Care scheme, and moving on to the Victorian Work Cover Authority scheme. We are aware of the significant increase that we will be faced with in the next and subsequent financial years as it relates to our workers' compensation premiums. There is a number of factors in relation to that. Some of them are policy-based, some of them are financial performance-based from the authority itself, some of them are based to the amount and the different categories of claims that we are receiving in this organisation. But with an organisation of 1,300 equivalent full-time employees, it does create a situation where, although the emphasis is on health and safety and creating a safe workplace as best as possible, these aspects will come up from time to time and they will have an impact upon our overall premiums. So that is a watch and hold position at this stage, which may have an impact on future budgetary positions. Insofar as the 13 other recommendations, I should say, that are in the final representation letter from the Auditor General's Office, we have agreed with all of them, and we are considering one further as it relates to a council-owned business. But it is pleasing to note that those findings and implications that the Auditor General identified as it relates to the overall business and financial position of the organisation were very low to moderate ratings, and even when some of those risks were identified and the recommendations were moderate, I did at the most recent Audit and Risk Committee voice to the Auditor General, I thought that they were perhaps being somewhat zealous insofar as their categorisation, and that was accepted to a point, although we don't in any way downplay
or not accept the recommendations, and particularly the response from the organisation in dealing with those aspects, because the ethos of good governance and sound financial principles is to ensure we receive that feedback and we act upon it accordingly. Chair, just making further reference before I conclude my remarks to the 2022-2023 performance statement, which is a very useful document insofar as assessing the performance of the organisation, not just from a financial perspective, but a range of non-financial indicators. This is based upon the Local Government's Performance Reporting Framework. It deals with a number of aspects around utilisation of our facilities, participation in various council activities and so forth, and it also deals with some of our specific indicators such as staff turnovers, health and safety indicators, and also participation in council services, particularly maternal and child health. These capacity indicators, particularly as they relate to sustainability, are within the expected range as compared to other councils of similar sizes. So we have to compare apples with apples. We are a large municipality, we have a large population, we have a large amount of services and expenditure that we need to manage. But if we look at the three critical indicators as it relates to our population, particularly on a municipal basis, which are expenses per head of municipal population, infrastructure per head of municipal population, and the population density per length of road, which are measurements to determine whether we are investing appropriate amounts in our services which we are operating, and also compared to those larger councils. And Chair, for reference, this is on page 73 of the council reports. The results are well and truly in the expected range, which is pleasing for an organisation of this size, and across a number of those service performance indicators, those results equally are in the expected range. There is one standout as it relates to maternal and child health, which does show that there has unfortunately been a 12% decrease in the participation in maternal and child health services, which is noteworthy, notwithstanding that we do have an increasing population within the municipality. 100 families do move into the municipality per week. But to mitigate that, the organisation has invested into a scheme which we are committed to training 12 maternal and child health students this year, and a further 12 students for next year, in an attempt to provide the right level of skills, the right level of services, and to deal with some of those challenges that undoubtedly that very important sector is faced with, so that we can continue to provide what is a very high standard and a valuable service to the community overall. So with those comments, Chair, I do wear two hats, one obviously as a member of the Audit and Risk Committee, which has been alluded to, and also as Administrator, to say that the analysis and the interpretation that I have conducted in regards to our performance statement, our financial statements, the management reports and the closing reports from the Auditor Generals does show that the organisation is in a very sound financial position, notwithstanding there are many challenges ahead that we have discussed at a number of council meetings previously. It is a credit to the CFO and the executive and the staff within the organisation that we do have the utmost in good governance and financial management and reporting. Again, I do place on my record appreciation to the Audit and Risk Committee members who have been equally vigilant and supportive in ensuring that all aspects of this council's performance and service delivery indicators have been thoroughly assessed and evaluated. And with those words, Chair, I do pleasingly and very proudly, in considering the work that has been done to get to this point, move the 6 recommendations as put, and present these reports on the basis that the organisation is in a strong financial position to continue to deliver high services in the community's expectation, notwithstanding that there still remains a number of challenges for the future.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. That's a most comprehensive summary and overview, and I appreciate the thinking and the work that you've done in summarising what is the most complex of reports. This is an exceptional report card, and it's an exceptional process, really. It stems through the whole year, and I think from a community perspective, in reading this report, it provides not just an overview of Council's financial performance, but service performance and comparison to other similar councils. I also record my appreciation for the work that has gone into the development of this, but also the work that sits behind it throughout the year in terms of the detail of service provision and overall management of the operations of this city. And with that, I move to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.3, land acquisition 300 Hardies Road, Clyde North, and I seek a mover.
And Chair, I'll move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll second that and invite you to speak.
Chair, it's a very straightforward procedural recommendation that does incorporate a confidential attachment relating to the evaluation of the acquisition in question. This relates to the Clyde Creek Precinct Structure Plan and the Clyde Development Contributions Plan. It designates the acquisition of the land as indicated in the council report for the widening of Hardies Road. There has been a negotiated agreement for the property of 300 Hardies Road, Clyde North, and that will indeed, once acquired, facilitate the future duplication of the road. I have, as I said, referenced the confidential attachment and the valuation. I've reviewed council's policy as it relates to acquisitions and our property considerations. I've also reviewed our legislative obligations, and I am satisfied that we have complied with all regulatory and policy considerations in this regard, and for that reason I am pleased to accept and move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I have nothing further to add. I'll move to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.4, KC Growth Areas, payment from reserves. I seek a mover for the recommendation.
Chair, I'll move item 5.4 recommendation.
Thank you. I'll second that. And do you have anything to speak to?
Chair, again, a very procedural recommendation that also incorporates a confidential attachment which outlines the contributions regarding the payments for the Mizzen's Road Cranbourne West Works, that is coming out of the contribution plan reserve, and also the public open space contribution reserves, which is utilised to either as a cash payment or in principle vesting of land, depending on the location of the area, for a local park identified in a relevant precinct structure plan. If I just make reference to Mizzen's Road, it does include an upgrade of the Thompsons Road, Mizzen's Road signalised intersections. It also includes the balance of Gwen Road from its current terminus east to Mizzen's Road and the balance of Volk Road from its current terminus west to Mizzen's Road. So it will have a significant impact on easing traffic congestion in the local area and be consistent with the Cranbourne West PSP, as I've already alluded to. So having reviewed the confidential attachments and the payments necessary to meet the obligations under both precinct structure plans, I'm pleased to move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.5, Victorian Child-Friendly Cities and Communities. Do I have a mover?
Chair, I will move the recommendation at item 5.5.
And I'll second that recommendation and invite you to speak to the motion.
And Chair, I move this on the basis that this is a common sense and uncontroversial endorsement of the Victorian Child-Friendly Cities and Communities Charter, which is not only aligned to our community engagement policy and council plan, but it also seeks to deliberate engagement on matters which are important to children and young people, and also to ensure that any feedback that we receive from children and young people is incorporated into our thinking. And whilst that may sound somewhat optimistic, the formalities around engaging with children and young people do have some challenges in their own right. If I could use a specific case study, Chair, that we've done exactly that, and I'll say with some significantly impressive results that did absolutely impact upon our thinking, and that was the Doveton Pool in the park. And one of the engagement activities that the organisation undertook was to not just meet with the local users of the Doveton Pool, but also the younger people who are users, the local school community, and invite them into various workshops to seek their feedback and thoughts on what the future utilisation of the site was. And as you would recall, Chair, the report that we received, the very comprehensive report that we received from that did highlight that the younger people involved in that engagement did come up with some extraordinarily good and positive ideas that undoubtedly has been shaped and inputted into the overall planning and future consideration of that site. So this is completely consistent with what we've done in the past. It's completely consistent with what we will do in the future. And when we look at what the needs of and the obligations under the Charter is, it's simply to amplify the voice of children and young people in decision-making forums. We do this, as I've said, not just through those direct engagement, also requesting feedback from young people who are involved in Children's Week's activities. We have the annual Casey Youth Summit, and we're also including children's and young people opinion in new building project groups such as Doveton, such as Bunjil Place, such as other significant developments that are impacting and will continue to positively impact upon the municipality. So this is a common sense approach, something which I believe the organisation has attempted to bring to council in the past, sadly unsuccessfully, but having reviewed the Charter, looking at its alignment with not just the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also with what council's plans and activities, and giving that specific case study is completely consistent with our policies and approach, and one which I am very pleased to endorse.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I note that we will join 19 other local government organisations and a further 18 other organisations that have signed the Charter. The example that you gave of consultation is one of many I know that have been undertaken with the challenging exercise, I think, of engaging children and young people with respect to key questions in terms of council's operations. So I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.6, priority of access to community facilities policy. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Chair, I'll move the recommendation at item 5.6.
Thank you, and I'll second that and invite you to say a few words.
Thank you, Chair, and in doing that I will state that this is a clarification document insofar as how we assess applications and prioritise those applications as it relates to those who are seeking to utilise council assets and facilities. There are currently over 65,000 people annually who utilise our council-owned buildings for various purposes, and there are 550 programs on a monthly basis that are housed in a variety of council assets. Previously, there has been some misinterpretation of access principles, and also not clear or streamlined approaches in the application basis, which is what this particular policy is seeking to address. There will be 3 priority access levels under this new principles, this new policies, which will be quite simply that the first priority will be direct council services. They will be given the highest priority for access and use, which is a very common sense and straightforward interpretation of the principles. The second priority will be for not-for-profit community groups and community service organisations, which could range from senior citizens groups, other community groups, migrant groups, many different groups that utilise council facilities for various purposes. They will be given priority based upon the weighting and the criteria within the principles themselves. And then that brings to the third priority, which will be commercial and private hires conducting the activities for the purpose of deriving a profit. So the principles do go into the criteria, which is the assessment considerations, which include the community priorities as I've articulated, the health and wellbeing strategy alignment, the local organisations with local participants to ensure that there is a significant representation of Casey residents and Casey impacted organisations, that there is attention to the underrepresented or emerging groups, services or programs, so that anyone who may not necessarily be advantaged in accessing such facilities are represented equally under the principles, that these principles will be adopted collaboratively, integrated and complementary, and that managements around risk, and these include safety, reputational, environmental, financial factors as are assessed in relation to each application. The policy and the principles do give very clear
guidelines on the assessment scoring at Appendix 1. It does show that where various categories are either excellent, good, possible or low, and the criteria and how that is assessed is provided not just insofar as the assessment template, but also a guideline to organisations who may want to use council properties in the future. So whilst it is something that internally will be utilised to look at a more equitable way of allocating applications for council properties, it also should serve as a guideline or a template for organisations to draft their applications accordingly. So with those comments, I do trust that the questionnaire, the sample questionnaire is Appendix 2, and the principles and the clarity and the transparency conducted with the principles do provide for a much more streamlined process that not just represents those applicants more equitably, but also provides for a simpler and much more effective assessment and utilisation basis. With those words, I'm happy to endorse the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. I too am very pleased to support this motion. I think it creates a process that is much more transparent and therefore accountable with respect to the decisions that are made, and given the range of facilities and the number of community groups and others that are looking to access council services, I do not envy the task of officers in allocating services and access. So I think the way that this is written and the transparent nature of it is a very positive addition to the decision-making processes that occur. With that, I support the motion and put it to the vote. All in favour? Carried. The final item this afternoon is item 5.7. Last but not least, the endorsement of the Community Local Law for public exhibition. Do I have a mover for item 5.7?
Chair, I'll move 5.7.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. I'll second that and invite you to speak to your motion.
Chair, as you have alluded to, this is an endorsement of the Community Local Law of 2023 to be placed on public exhibition for a period of 4 weeks. This is equally an extremely important document for not just this organisation but the community as a whole, because it does deal with a range of nuisance and other considerations under the local law and puts in place guidelines for permitted usages, but also importantly puts in place penalties for non-permitted uses. The revisions that have been undertaken have addressed a number of administrative errors that were under the 2018 local law. There is a side-by-side comparison within the council papers of the 2018 local law, over 5 years old of course, vis-a-vis the much more clear, much more concise, much more easily interpret 2023 document, and I would encourage interested community members to reflect and review the two versions and importantly provide feedback to us so we can incorporate any further changes or amendment as necessary. There are a number of key changes and I'll briefly just touch on those as it relates to animal offences including nuisance. They're reflected in Part 3 of the local law. Vacant land, there's new clauses relating to unsightly properties. The enforcement capabilities regarding mandatory fencing have been streamlined and are dealt with much more clearly. There is a provision around that abandoned vehicles can be removed under Schedule 11. There is delegated approvals. There is incorporation of the Asset Protection Local Law 2016, including the definitions around that. There is a short stay accommodation code of practice, and this is something which is quite a comprehensive description on what those guidelines and what the use of short stay premises can be. But it is acknowledged that even today, with commentary from the Premier and the Prime Minister, that there may be changes to the tax and statutory interpretation of short-term rental platforms, which include Airbnb. And whilst we have yet to be briefed on any specific details, if there is any requirements under a regulation or statute to make any further adjustments to local laws, we will do that. It's probably optimistic to suggest that that will happen in the public reporting period, but it is something that we have noted and we will deal with. There is also a review and update of the definitions, which is quite clearly articulated in Part 2. And the penalty units are indexed in line with the state government legislation, which is the one penalty unit is $100.
This is a significant community consultation exercise, one that we will be widely advertising and engaging with the communities. A 4-week public exhibition period is sufficient in the circumstances, but we do want as many interested members of the community to review the local laws and provide any feedback, not just on the administration and the interpretation, but also if there's any areas that have not been covered adequately and do need to be reviewed. And we will be taking on board any feedback we receive. We will be seeking further legal clarification and advice if there are any further changes to the local laws as they stand in draft format. And if that's the case, we'll come back to the council, I think probably around November or December for final adoption. Most importantly for the development community, the Building and Works Code of Practice on page 202 does provide clarification around what is the requirements under building permits and the code of practice for personnel who are responsible for building sites and works, and what their obligations are to meet their planning and environmental considerations. And having reviewed it, is a very clear and very sound set of guidelines that should provide clarification and consistency and certainty for those who are working on building sites and those engaged in the trade itself. So with those words, Chair, I've reviewed the local laws, I've reviewed the methodology and the implications and the legal advice that has gone into drafting the 2023 amendments, and I am pleased to move the recommendation to place these on public exhibition for a period of 4 weeks, along with the advertising schedule, the community impact statement against the assessment of the Charters of Human Rights. I've noted that any submissions we will consider at the October meeting, and that in December 2023 we will adopt the final local laws based upon all of those considerations I've mentioned.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. I'll put that matter to the vote. All in favour? Carried. That concludes officer reports this afternoon, and I move to item 6, consideration of reports of committees, and simply note the reports of committees and record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers. Item 7, petitions. There are none for this afternoon's council meeting. Item 8, late reports. There are no late reports. Item 9, no urgent business items received for the council meeting. And item 10, there are no reports for closed council. So that brings me to item 11. I declare the meeting closed, and thank you for joining us, those in the gallery and watching live stream this afternoon. Good afternoon.